So welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 1 for chapter 27, and we are going to be looking at a category of animals that not only has been able to become very well acclimated to the terrestrial environment, but they've also been able to take advantage of the air as well. And this category of animals is called the birds. Now, what's really interesting about this group of animals is that they actually have some characteristics that will not be found in any other group of animals. And the one that sticks out the most to most of us is that these animals actually have feathers. And this is going to be a unique hallmark of birds. Now, the forelimbs of these animals are going to be modified, of course, so you're no longer going to have what we would consider maybe a leg or an arm, but you're going to have now a wing. And of course, in most cases, those wings are going to allow that animal to be capable of flight. Now, the hind limbs are going to be adapted for either walking, swimming, or they could be adapted for perching on branches. Now, all birds are going to have a horny, keratinized beak, so that material that you find that makes up the beak of these animals is the same material that you would find in the claws of other animals. For example, maybe even the beaks of the turtles that we had looked at in the previous chapter. You could think about the scutes that make up, or the scales that make up the reptiles that we had looked at in chapter 26. All of them have that common component of keratin that makes up those structures. And of course, as we had said, all birds will lay eggs. In other words, you're not really going to find an example of a bird that's going to give birth to live young. Now, the driving force for this uniformity of these structures that we looked at in the previous slide appears to be the adaptations that are necessary for flight. In order to fly, of course, you need to have adapted some sort of structure that would allow you to basically support and propel that animal through the environment, in other words, through the air. And so those wings have allowed that animal to be able to do that. So that modification of those forelimbs. The respiratory system also had to be modified because if you think about it, if you're going to be doing something as strenuous as flying, that's going to take a lot of energy. And so there's going to be a lot of oxygen that's going to be necessary to make sure that that animal has the energy required to propel those wings. And of course, if you're going to be doing a lot of work in regards to the wings that are necessary to allow flight to happen, that's going to tend to raise the body temperature. And so there needs to be a respiratory system that allows the body to cool rather efficiently. Now, the bones of these animals had to be light in comparison to some of the skeletal structures we had looked at before. So they had to be light, but they also had to be somewhat rigid to support the extreme pressures that would be caused from an animal that had to, again, use a certain appendage to be able to lift itself off the ground. Now, digestion and circulation, again, had to meet the high energy demands of flight. So in other words, the amount of food that this animal might take in, those requirements might be a little bit higher than you would find in other groups because, of course, as we had said, flight requires a lot of energy, and you had to have a circulatory system that can move not only those nutrients, but again, the oxygen that we had talked about up here to the different parts of the body in a very efficient manner. And of course, the nervous system. You had to have superb sensory systems for what we would consider a high velocity flight. In other words, flight that might take place rather quickly. So if you think about it, if you're an animal that's flying through the air, there's a chance that there might be obstacles that you're going to have to avoid. And having a superb or efficient nervous system would be required to make sure that we avoid such obstacles. Now, as I had said earlier, when it comes down to birds, of course, the feathers basically allow this group to stand out from all the other groups that we have talked about up to this point. When you think about the feathers, as I had said, there's going to be lots of different types of feathers out there, but pretty much the structure of the feather is going to be relatively consistent among the different types that we're going to look at. The first thing you want to do is you want to think about the hollow quill that's going to emerge from the skin follicle and actually continue as what we consider the shaft or the rachi of the feather. So down here towards the right hand side, you're going to notice we have the quill of the feather located right through here. And again, that's going to basically make its way up through the center of the feather. And again, this is going to continue as a shaft or a rachi. And if you notice, the rachi is going to be right through here once you get to this point. Now, the rachi is going to bear the numerous barbs, and you're going to see the barbs being represented right through here. So this is sort of a magnified view of that feather. And so this right here would represent the barbs. And then we're going to have what we consider, depending again on the type of feather that we're looking at, you could have several hundred barbs that are arranged to form basically sort of a flat web structure, and that's going to be the vein of the feather. And so any of this area that you see right here is going to be considered the vein. Now each barb is going to resemble sort of a miniature feather in itself, and so if you look here, we have the barb as we had said, but then you have something called barbules that are going to be sort of overlapping each other. And so what they do is they basically allow this feather to sort of zip together. And if you've ever watched a bird preen its feathers, you'll notice that it basically runs its bill up and down these feathers. Well, what it's doing is it's making a connection between the barbules on this side and the barbules on this side, and basically there's these very, very super tiny hooks that allow that feather to sort of zip up. So when they get separated, the bird basically has to perform a task called preening, as we had said, and that preening is going to make sure that these feathers stay relatively in good shape to, of course, allow flight and maybe some other needed functions that that feather might provide to that bird. Now there's several types of feathers that are out there. We have those that are considered the contour feathers, and usually when you think about contour, you kind of think about shape. So the contour feathers are going to provide the form for the bird. Flight feathers do actually belong into this category of contour feathers, and those are the ones that tend to extend beyond the body and play a large part in flight. Now the down feathers are going to be those feathers that you'd find underneath the contour feathers, and oftentimes they're going to act as insulation. So they're going to act to basically allow that animal to stay relatively warm. Then we have those that are called the phyloplume feathers, and these are sort of hair-like feathers that you see over here on the right, and these are sort of what we consider degenerate feathers. In other words, they kind of look like feathers that have kind of been beat up a bit. And so they have somewhat of a weak shaft and a tuft of very short barbs sort of at the end. And you can see those barbs right through here. There are some speculation that these feathers actually might be used in sort of a sensory type of way for some birds. And then towards the bottom we have those called the powder down feathers. Now if you notice up here, the second type we had looked at was the down, and that was these right over here. These are considered powder down feathers, and a lot of times you'll see herons and any other type of water bird that's sort of related to these that will have quite a few of these types of feathers. And they basically disintegrate and they release sort of a talc-like powder type of substance, and they're basically there to waterproof the feathers that you would see on that bird. Now because we have an animal that has feathers, of course when it comes down to replacing those feathers, we give that process a special name, and we call that process molting. And the way that these birds actually molt is going to vary depending on the type of bird that you're looking at. So except in penguins, molting is a very gradual process, because you want to make sure it's gradual, because you want to make sure that you can avoid leaving any type of bare spots on the bird itself, except for in penguins. And down here towards the bottom, you can kind of definitely see the bald spots that you would notice on a penguin that's been molting. Now flight feathers and tail feathers tend to be lost in pairs, and so of course we have one of each type on each side of the animal's body. And the main reason for this is to make sure that we sort of maintain a balance in the body of that bird. Now in some species, replacement is going to be continuous because we need to make sure that the flight is unimpaired. But there's going to be a lot of water birds out there where basically they're going to molt all their feathers at once, and these are going to temporarily what we consider ground the bird. In other words, the bird's not going to be able to take flight, which could possibly open it up to predators. And so a lot of times during this time you'll see a large group of water birds that will stay very tight or very close together in a way to protect themselves. Now most birds will molt about once a year, and this typically takes place in late summer, usually after the nesting season has been completed. As we had said earlier, one thing that's really critical when it comes down to having a group of animals that can fly is we need to make sure that the relative weight of that animal is, well, definitely very light. And so in regards to the skeleton, which is typically made of bone, usually a skeleton is rather heavy, but in this case we have sort of modified, or the environment has sort of modified the bones to the point where the weight itself has been greatly reduced. So modern birds tend to have a light, delicate bone that's going to be laced with air cavities. And so over here on the right you can see all of the cavities found within this bone, and typically they call these bones pneumatized bones. Now they do tend to be very strong because if you notice we have a pretty extensive lattice network that extends throughout the bone, so that helps to lend integrity to the bone. But of course when you have these empty spaces, it's going to lighten up that bone quite a bit. Now the bird's skull is going to be fused into one piece, and the brain case and the orbits, which is the area that actually holds the eyes, are going to be relatively large, because now we have an animal that actually has what we would consider, I guess, somewhat of an intelligent nature to itself, and so this larger brain is going to accommodate that. And of course, we have large eyes in a lot of cases, because these animals will oftentimes rely very heavily on their sight. Now, while the skull is lighter, the legs do tend to be heavier than what you would see in mammals. And so, of course, this would be to somewhat lower the center of gravity for the birds. In other words, they're going to use these legs to support the entire weight of the bird itself, and so it kind of makes sense to make those parts a little bit heavier than the rest. Now, the jaws of the birds are going to be horny, keratinous beaks, and again, as we had said before, that keratin-like nature has been seen in the reptiles, and you also see that in the mammals as well. And this is going to be molded around the bony jaws that you would find in the skull of this animal. Now, still looking at the skeletal structure of these animals, you're going to notice that the vertebral column tends to be very rigid, and it's going to be somewhat fused except for the cervical vertebrae. So that would be the vertebrae that you would find right in this area, and that's going to allow the animal to be able to move its neck from side to side. And that's going to be pretty important, because when you look at the eyes of these birds, they tend to be fixed. In other words, birds can't really move their eyes back and forth, and they actually have to move their heads to be able to see around themselves. The ribs are going to be mostly fused with the vertebrae, the pectoral girdle, and the sternum. And so down here you can see the ribs right through here. So these would be considered the ribs of the animal. Right here you're going to see the sternum, so it's going to be this large plate-like structure right here, and the pectoral girdle actually contains all three of these pieces right through here. So all of this is going to be fused with the ribs. Now the sternum is going to bear what we consider a large keel, and that keel is necessary because it's going to be acting as an anchor for the muscles that are going to be used to control flight. Now the bones in the forelimbs are going to be very highly modified for flight, and most of the caudal vertebrae are going to be fused into something called a pygostyle. And you're going to notice right over here that that particular structure is right there. And so all of these vertebrae are going to be fused. So this pretty much represents the tail region of this animal. So it kind of supports the back part or the posterior part of the animal. So if you have an animal that can actually fly, you're going to need to make sure that you have a very efficient muscular system. And so in this case, we have a group of animals that has two primary types of muscles which sort of participate in allowing that animal to be able to fly. And the first one is the pectoralis muscles, and the second is going to be the supracoracoideus muscle. Now, the pectoralis muscle, what you're looking at is you're looking at a muscle that will actually be used to depress the wing. And so the pectoralis muscle is this one right through here, and you can see the name right here. So it's actually this muscle. And if you notice, when this muscle contracts, it's going to basically pull the wing down, and so this is going to represent the wing, and so the direction of the wing is going to be in a sort of a downward motion. Now, once that muscle relaxes, the supracoracoideus muscle is going to contract, and it's going to sort of work by a rope and pulley type of arrangement. Because if you notice, the supracoracoideus muscle is this one right through here. And if you notice, the tendon is wrapped right around this part of the wing, or the bone that supports the wing of this bird. And so when it contracts, it's going to pull in this direction, and in essence, as we had said, it kind of acts like a pulley type of mechanism, and it's going to cause that wing to move upwards. And so those two muscles are going to work in conjunction with each other, and that's what's going to sort of allow the flapping motion that you would see as a bird flies through its environment. Now, when it comes down to these animals actually perching, you have a lot of these animals that will actually sleep on their perch. And so in order to make sure that they don't actually fall from the perch, they have what we consider a toe locking mechanism. So a lot of the muscles and tendons that you would see that are found throughout the feet of these animals will actually lock in place to sort of prevent that animal from falling off the branch as it sleeps. And you can see this sort of locking mechanism being represented over here on the right hand side. Alright, so that's going to finish up our very first screencast for chapter 27. Please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide before you come to class.